So, hi everybody. Here we go. I understand we are live now. Hello, my name is Geert Vermeulen. And for the next hour or so, I hope you're going to be standing with me. so, I think what would be the proper thing to do is that I quickly introduce myself. I will do that showing the next slide. So my name is Geert Vermeulen, but you can also call me Gert Vermeulen. That's all fine with me. Today I'm calling in from Rotterdam. So I'm in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So my mission is to help organizations to act in an ethical and compliant way. I've been an ethics and compliance professional for the last 20 years. And I spent most of my time, most of those 20 years at a company called Aon, the insurance broker, reinsurance broker, employee benefits consultant. And my last position at Aon was the Chief Compliance Officer for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, coordinating compliance in some 60 countries. Then I moved on to Demco, which used to be a business unit of the AP Møller Maersk Group. So I was working in logistics. Over there I was the global head of compliance, coordinating compliance in some 90 countries, 90. And after a short period at the Netherlands Compliance Institute, I started my own company, ECMC, 5 years ago. ECMC, Ethics and Compliance, Management and Consulting. Ethics and compliance, because I strongly believe that those two belong together. So with ECMC, I'm a teacher, trainer, speaker, also a guest lecturer at universities. I'm a consultant and an interim ethics and compliance officer. And recently, let's say, well, a little less than a year ago, I started a new company called the Integrity Coordinator. And with the Integrity Coordinator, I'm offering my services as an independent coordinator of whistleblowing procedures. And that's going to be the topic that we're going to be discussing in the next hour or so. I'm also quite active in the profession. So I'm the former president of the Netherlands Compliance Officers Association, where I'm still chairing the expert group on financial economic crime. I'm also a member of the expert group on culture and behavior. Besides that, I hold a couple of positions. I put it down here that I'm a member of the Professional Advisory Committee of the Compliance Minor at The Hague University. Okay, so a few words about the picture. So when I founded ECMC, I think my ambition was to become a thought leader in compliance. And a bit to my surprise, beginning of last year, I was awarded the National Compliance Award. So I thought, okay, so I already accomplished my mission. So that's great. What am I going to do now? So maybe I should retire. No, just kidding. It's way too much fun. So yeah, I put this slide here. So who are you? Now, unfortunately, I cannot see who you are at the moment. But what I did do is that a couple of days ago, I checked who signed up for the overall conference. So I noticed that a lot of people from the United States working for big multinational companies. So going forward, I'm going to assume that my audience is going to be, well, let's say majority US based, working for large corporates. But if you have questions, like for example, because you are looking at the presentation from a different perspective, please feel free to put something in the chat, and then the moderator will, Aaron will warn me that there is a question. So and feel free to ask questions. Okay. So going back in time a little bit, let's say 15 years ago. I was working at a US-based company, and I was working on making sure that we were compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley legislation. So in this time frame, from 2006, 2009, I was working on rolling out whistleblowing procedures in some 60 countries in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Now, the Middle East and Africa was usually not that difficult. The problem areas were in the EU, in the European Union. So because we, let's say in almost every country, I faced the challenge that the local legislation was different and also not always that welcoming, let's say, for a US company trying to roll out a whistleblowing procedure. So we came across the fact, for example, that also the data privacy legislation in each country was a little bit different. And in the end, we came up with a data privacy tier. And as a result, let's say all the reports that came in from my region, so from Europe, Middle East, and Africa, I would coordinate those cases. I would also anonymize them and then replicate them to my US colleagues, to the headquarters. So we were using a specific data privacy tier where only I could see the names of the individuals. We also faced a problem that reports in some countries were limited to certain categories. Like, for example, in France, you could only make reports in 4 or 5 categories, like fraud and bribery and corruption and things like that. And if it would fall outside of that scope, it could not be reported through the whistleblowing procedure. So that was a shame. Then there were countries where you could only make reports about the management. And there were countries where you could make reports about anyone. There were countries where you could not make an anonymous report, so that would be heavily discouraged. So we would have to take away the possibility to make an anonymous report. And in quite a few countries, we needed the approval from the Works Council or the union. So in the end, this was a pretty long project. It took me a couple of years, but in the end, we got it organized in, let's say, in 58 of the 60 countries. The only countries where I was not able to put the global whistleblowing procedure in place were Germany and Spain for various reasons. So in the end, we had to rely on a local whistleblowing procedure over there. Then every month or so, I would ask my local people, like, okay, so did anyone report something through the local procedure? Okay. Now, in the last decade, so from 2010, 2020, we noticed that things started to shift a little bit. Things started to change a little bit. So we noticed that public opinion started to change in the EU countries, and national legislation started to change with it. In the Netherlands, for example, so where I am from, where I am based, in 2016, a whistleblowing legislation was introduced, also introducing a whistleblowing authority, the House for Whistleblowers. And all the companies, all the organizations with more than 50 employees had to put in place a whistleblowing procedure. So now, I had high expectations of that. The expectations were not always met, but what we also see is that an institute like that, it takes a couple of years to get them warmed up. So the start of the institute was quite disappointing, but at this moment, I think they are fastly improving. And they made a couple, the Dutch Whistleblowing Authority, they handled a couple remarkable cases lately. And it's my intention to write a couple blogs about that. Now, in France, for example, as a result of the Loi Sapin II, which is basically an anti-corruption law, which says that French companies, they need to put, let's say, adequate procedures in place to make sure that there's no bribery and corruption going on, or to discourage bribery and corruption. And so as a result of that legislation, one of the elements there was also that a whistleblowing procedure had to be introduced. The company had more than 50 employees. So where, let's say, years before that, you could only make reports into certain categories. Now, all of a sudden, the law obliged companies in France to have a whistleblowing procedure. So from my perspective, it was a major change. Previously, you also had to go to the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, to ask for approval. But instead of asking for approval, we now had to It is now obliged to have one by law. We saw some changes in Italy, where there was a law introduced in respect of the reporting of bribery and corruption, where if a whistleblower would face retaliation because he made a report on suspicion of corruption, there was now a reversal of proof. So the whistleblower would be protected, and there was a reversal of proof. So the company had to prove that if somebody was dismissed, that it was not as a result of the corruption accusation. In 2018, Ireland introduced a hotline to report bribery and corruption, and also Germany and Spain, in the course of time, they allowed anonymous reporting. So, you know, compared to a decade earlier, quite a big change, I would say. Now, one of the reasons for that is, let's say, what we saw in the middle of the last decade is all the, sometimes I call them the X leaks. So you have the Luxembourg leaks, the Swiss leaks, we had the football leaks, the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, and what have you. I'm also a bit of an anti-corruption specialist, so I'm still celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the 5-year anniversary of the disclosure of the Union oil files. Which was for me a major thing. So yeah, so we saw all those these big leaks, and I was also wondering, as an ethics and compliance officer, like, okay, so what does this mean? So when often when I'm providing training, I'm telling people like, okay, so maybe in the past you thought that you could still keep things confidential. Forget about that. So you got to bear in mind when you are an ethics and compliance professional that one day whatever you advise is going to become public, and people will learn about what you wrote, and often they will look at it with the values that they at that moment. So they may look at something that happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but they will judge it with the values, the societal values of that moment. So that is something to bear in mind whenever you take a decision or provide an advice on ethics and compliance. Now, all these leaks made quite an impact, especially the Luxembourg leaks. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on those. So what happened there, what we saw there is that there were two persons, Antoine Deltour and Raphaël Hallet, and they were working for PricewaterhouseCoopers at the moment. And they saw something that they were, where they thought, okay, so this isn't right. So what they did is that they decided to leak confidential information to a bunch of journalists, originally to one journalist, and then a little bit later on also to the ICIJ. So they leaked that information about the tax deals that large corporations were able to conclude in Luxembourg with the Luxembourg authorities. Now, the thing is that there was nothing illegal about those tax deals. The only thing is that when the public learned about them, quite a few people got upset. Like, okay, so why are these big, large corporations, why are they trying to evade taxes through Luxembourg? So Luxembourg should not be facilitating that. So there was lots of commotion in the press. And Deltour and Hallet got prosecuted. So they were arrested. The picture here on the slide, you can see Antoine Deltour being, I think he's going outside of the courtroom at that moment. So they were prosecuted. And at first instance, they were sentenced to 12 or 9 months in jail because they had leaked confidential information. And they also got a small fine. Now, there was a lot of commotion again in the public about this case. Like lots of people said, okay, so, you know, those people, they were whistleblowers and they were doing the right thing. So they should not go to jail for that. There was an appeal. And in second instance, they received a suspended jail sentence. And they appealed against that decision again, because they said, well, we are convinced that we were doing the right thing. And So we don't want to have a conviction behind our name. And so there was a third trial, and in the end, they were acquitted, indeed. And I think Mr. Deltour, and also Mr. Halet, I think they were fired, so they were out of a job, they didn't have any money, and some money was raised to support them. So what we see there is that the public opinion shifted. And remarkably, also the judges, they looked like they were shifting along with the public. So at first instance, they were sentenced for leaking confidential information. But in the end, the judges said, well, we think they acted in the public interest, so they should not be jailed. Now, meanwhile, what we also saw is that the European Commission and the OECD, they started looking into those Luxembourg leaks, and they also thought like, okay, so, you know, this isn't right. We got to do something about that. And in the end, they came up with what we call the BEPS. I think it's base, I forgot what the abbreviation is about, but it's tax related. So, and making sure that large corporations, that they pay a fair amount of tax in the countries where they are active. And the case reminded me a little bit. So if you are in the US and you are a little bit older, then you probably remember the case with UBS and Bradley Birkenfeld. So Mr. Birkenfeld, who was a whistleblower, he was working at UBS, and he revealed that a lot of rich Americans, they were hiding their wealth in Swiss bank accounts. And UBS was helping that with that. So he disclosed that to the authorities. So he was a whistleblower. He also went to jail because he was also part of this behavior. So he had been advising clients as well in the past to bring their money to Switzerland. So first he went to jail, but then he got a percentage of the fine that UBS was imposed. So I think he earned something like $104 million if I'm not mistaken. And the last time I got a LinkedIn message from him the other day. So it appears that he is now living in Malta, and I guess enjoying his wealth out of jail. Yeah. So, but you know, as a result of this case, specifically this case, I think we now have FATCA. The Foreign Tax Compliance Act. Again, we see that there's a whistleblower, there's a lot of commotion, whistleblower goes to jail, but the authorities start looking into that, and they think, you know what, this isn't right. We're going to come up with another law to prevent this from happening. Now, on April 23, 2018, the European Commission also thought like, okay, so we got to do something with this whistleblowing topic. And they came up with the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. And when they first published it, so it was an initiative, I think, from the European Commission. When they published it, they were referring to LuxLeaks, the Panama Papers, and also to Cambridge Analytica. And my fellow countryman, Vice President Frans Timmermans of the European Commission said, many recent scandals may never have come to light if insiders hadn't had the courage to speak out. So if we better protect whistleblowers, we can better detect and prevent harm to the public interest. And there should be no punishment for doing the right thing. So this is, let's say, the background of the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. So here you see on this picture, you see Frans Timmermans on the left, and on the right hand, you see Vera Jourova, at that moment, the Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality. And she added, like, we need to support people who are ready to take the risk to uncover serious violations of EU law. And we owe it to the honest people of Europe. So that's a bit of the history on this. Another underlying fact is that in 2017, the European Commission, they ordered a study, and they asked for this study because they wanted to know a bit more about the economic benefits of whistleblowing protection. And so they said, okay, so solely focusing on public procurement, this report estimated that the European Union could save somewhere between 5.6 and 9.6 billion euros annually, only saving costs on public procurement by protecting whistleblowers. Now, I don't know how they came up with this figure. I'm a macroeconomist by background, so I know a thing or two about statistics. So I'm not really comfortable with the money amount. I also don't think it's specifically large, but I think that the direction is clear. So by protecting whistleblowers, that will you will have economic benefits. A bit to my disappointment, there were a couple other studies, for example, by the in the United Kingdom by the Financial Services Authority, and in the Netherlands also by the Financial Supervisor, that said that there was no evidence that whistleblowing rewards lead to better or more reports. So what you see in the European Union, contrary to the US, is that the idea is that we're going to protect whistleblowers because they should not face retaliation for doing the right thing. But we will not offer them money for that. So even though they may suffer in the beginning, we think that most whistleblowers, they should act because they intrinsically feel that something is not right and they have to do something about it. So there are no, at this moment, as far as I know, there are no whistleblowing rewards in the EU. That's, as far as I know, also not going to change. Now, this economic benefits thing is not a surprise to me and not to any ethics and compliance officer, I expect. So I think many of us are familiar with the fraud triangle. So often when things go wrong, we see that that there has been pressure. So employees are under pressure to do something strange. Maybe they have some ambitious targets, or maybe now in the Corona situation, they are not sure whether they are going to keep their job. Then often there's also opportunity. So like, for example, a lack of controls. So they have an opportunity to commit a fraud. And then afterwards, they usually rationalize it like, okay, so it isn't that bad what we were doing, what I was doing, because my boss was doing it as well, or this is only a small money amount, or I should have gotten a promotion, or so most people, they don't want to be considered as bad people. So they rationalize why they commit a fraud or have done something that may not be that ethical. Now, I put against that the ethics and compliance triangle. That's what I do with my company, ECMC. So I say, okay, so in order to prevent misconduct, I'm looking at governance, controls, and culture and behavior. So I developed that into a model with 10 elements. So if you are familiar a bit with the federal sentencing guidelines, you probably recognize a couple elements. Maybe you are missing due diligence, but due diligence, I usually consider that to be part of the policies and procedures. So I learned when looking at those 10 elements that responding to concerns, speak up, the whistleblowing procedure, that is really an essential part of an effective ethics and compliance program. So I have often, in those years as an ethics and compliance officer, I have handled a couple hundred cases. And I often came across situations where a whistleblower reported something, and I was looking, and we did the investigation, and I was looking at that in retrospect, and I thought, okay, so could I have that discovered in any other way? And sometimes the answer was no. So sometimes we discovered pretty bad things through whistleblowers, which I probably would never have found in any other way. So I have really appreciated always my whistleblowers. That is, when a whistleblowing report comes in, at first instance, I often think like, oh no, extra work. So I'm not always looking for extra work. But in the end, after a couple of months, I'm usually pretty happy with those whistleblowers, and I cherish them, and I encourage them to communicate their concerns, and if possible, even quickly. So I also noticed that, let's say, when there is a report coming up, of course, at a given moment, you start an investigation. If it appears that there was some misconduct going on, of course, you have to take disciplinary measures, and that is also very much dependent also on the leadership. The leadership that also has a large influence on the culture and behavior, and how you deal with the speak up procedure. Like, are you open and transparent, and do you have an open culture of admitting mistakes and speaking up? That also has a huge influence on culture and behavior and trust. So therefore, it's not a big surprise to me that, let's say, almost every year, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners comes up with a report with some statistics that are more or less always a little bit like this. So they say that the average loss due to fraud in a company is usually 5% of the revenue. They also indicate that more than 50% of the frauds are discovered through reporters, through whistleblowers, and then the large majority of the reporters are actually your own employees. And number two are the clients, and some of them are anonymous, so we don't know who they are. Maybe they are clients, maybe they are employees, and some 11% are discovered through reports from suppliers. So I always say, so you do the math, you can calculate the benefit of your whistleblowing procedure. And of course, I think many of us will be familiar with this slide as well. So a couple of years ago, Mr. Kyle Welsh conducted a survey. Kyle Welsh, he was working at the George Washington University, and he came up in the end with this report. So he had a very large database with whistleblowing reports, and he could, they were anonymized, but he could still connect them through the respective companies. And in the end, he calculated that, and it's a bit counterintuitive, but the conclusion is that if you have more whistleblowing reports, you will have better financial results. So that looks a bit counterintuitive, because you would expect that if you have more whistleblowing reports, there's probably something going wrong. But actually, it's the other way around. So if you have more whistleblowing reports, you will have fewer litigation costs because you are more on top of things. So you can earlier address problem areas. You will also have fewer material lawsuits and an increased return on assets. And the remarkable thing is that I'm also familiar with a survey with some research in the Netherlands with a pretty similar outcome. Okay, some of the background. So now we have this EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. It has been adopted by the European Parliament and the European Council on the 23rd of October in 2019. And it prohibits retaliation against whistleblowers. So whistleblowers are individuals who report wrongdoing encountered in a work-related context. And we're going to discuss that a little bit further in a few moments. So retaliation means can take all kinds of shapes and forms. So it includes dismissal, suspension, demotion, poor evaluations, and so on. Now, I think what is remarkable also on the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive is that there is a reversal of the burden of proof. If a reporter has a bad evaluation or gets demoted, he can go to the authorities and say, okay, so I made this whistleblowing report, and as a result, I got demoted, or I got a bad evaluation. And then it's up to the organization, up to the company, to prove that that is wrong. So there is a reversal of proof. And I think that is quite an important element in this Whistleblower Protection Directive. Also, the directive says that each country, so each EU member state, has to set up a whistleblowing authority, a national independent authority, where you can go to, for example, if there is if you made a report and you face retaliation, but you can also go there to ask for advice, and they will also provide some psychological support. Because we know that quite a few whistleblowers, they go through difficult times when they decide to blow that whistle. So the whistleblowing authorities, the national whistleblowing authorities, they are supposed to set up something to provide psychological support to whistleblowers. So not financial support, but psychological support. Let me just take a sip of water. So within this EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, companies are obliged to set up whistleblowing procedures. So whistleblowers should first report internally, and they can do that in writing, orally, or both. So it's not like there's no law saying that you have to provide a telephone line. So that's at this moment still up to you. So you can also just put a web form in place or an email address, but it has to be confidential. So you can wonder, okay, so if we just open up an email address, is that really a confidential whistleblowing procedure? I tend to say it is not. Now, I think also an important new element is that companies, they not only have to guarantee that there is a confidential whistleblowing procedure, they also have to they have to nominate an impartial and competent coordinator. So I think that is another important, relatively new aspect. Now, suppose that you decide not to put a whistleblowing procedure in place. There's not going to be a fine, at least not under the EU directive. Still, I would not advise you to do that. So I would advise you to put a good whistleblowing procedure in place, because there's something else. So the directive also says that when a whistleblower makes a report, the organization has to respond with a confirmation of receipt within 7 days. So I would prefer to do that a little bit faster than that, but the benchmark is it has to happen within 7 days. And also, and I think this is also an important element, the organization has to come back to the whistleblower with some substantial feedback within 3 months after the 7 days. So within 3 months after submission of the report, you have to get back to the reporter and say a few words on what happened with the report. So where are you with the investigation? It doesn't necessarily mean that the investigation has to be finished and closed, but you have to come back with some substantial information. Because if you don't, the reporter can go public. So if the reporter thinks that the company, the organization is not doing anything with that report, the reporter can decide to go public, so they can go to the authorities or they can go to the press. And when they do that, they are no longer bound by any confidentiality clauses. So think about the LuxLeaks whistleblowers who went to the press because they saw something and they felt, okay, so this is wrong. And then they were sued for violating confidentiality clauses. So in the future, that will no longer be possible. And I think this is something, this is also an important aspect that the organization should keep in mind. Now, before I continue, there's something else that is important. So in the EU, in the European Union, we have regulations and we have directives. So a regulation means So when the EU adopts a regulation, then the regulation applies directly into each of the member states. And an example of that is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So we have the GDPR, and that applies directly in all of the member states. So it is more or less the same in all of the EU. Nevertheless, in practice, you will still see some small differences between a few countries, because there will still be national supervisory authorities. So there can be differences in interpretation of the law. And the countries can also put in place some additional legislation. And as a result, you can still have small variations, but in general, also a regulation usually says, okay, so you have the same law all over Europe. Now, in this case, we're talking about the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. And a directive is different. So this is something that is adopted by the EU, and then each of the member states have to implement that into their law, into their national law. And the directive sort of sets the minimum standards. Local governments have the option, they have the freedom to go above the minimum standards. And so the EU Whistleblowing Directive only sets the minimum standards and has to be implemented in the national law of the member states. An example of another type of legislation, what you see here is like, for example, we have the 4th, the 5th, 6th EU Money Laundering Directive, which is just a little bit different in each of the member states. Like, for example, in most of the EU countries, if you are subject to anti-money laundering laws, you have to report, you have to submit suspicious activity reports, but not in the Netherlands. You have to submit an unusual activity report. So as a result, in the Netherlands, we have far more reports than in many of the other EU member states. So there can still be differences between the member states. Now, what does it mean for the whistleblowing procedure? Well, before we go there, let's have a look at the progress. Because this EU Whistleblowing Directive, the Whistleblower Protection Directive, has to be put in place ultimately per this, December 17, 2021. So at this moment, halfway April, there are less than 8 months to go before the deadline. So that means that all of the member states, they only have 8 months to go to implement the whistleblowing directive, and then it will apply almost immediately. So the laws, the national laws, should enter into force per December 17. So what we see now in April 2021 is that 6 out of the 27 member states have not even started yet. So we're talking about Austria, Cyprus, Hungary, Italy, Luxembourg, Malta. So they even haven't started the legislative process yet. So I'm almost sure that they will be too late. If you want to keep track of the national developments, there's a website called EU Whistleblowing Meter. If you just if you Google that, or you search in DuckDuckGo or whatever search engine you use, you will get there. So you can check what the status is in each of the EU member states. So in a large number of the member states, we have now seen a public consultation of the law. So there has been a draft law that has been open to the public to provide comments. But there's no country that adopted the final version of the law yet. And so Transparency International, they published this report, like, are EU governments taking whistleblower protection seriously? Well, let's say they are not that enthusiastic as the European institutions. Let me put it like that. You may also wonder, okay, so what's happening with Brexit in the UK? So the UK, the United Kingdom, is no longer part of the European Union. However, they have been part of this process for a while. And I know that they are also looking to set up something similar. So whatever the United Kingdom is going to come up, it's not going to be that much different from whatever is going to be implemented in the rest of the EU. That is my expectation. Okay, so let's have another look at the scope. So what is the scope of the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive? Well, it is about reporters who report a violation of EU law. So that's, let's say, the minimum. But countries are allowed, of course, to go over and above that. So what we see is that, for example, especially Estonia and Latvia, they have proposed new legislation that is very broad, encompasses almost everything. And we have countries like the Czech Republic, Denmark, Sweden, that also proposed a pretty broad scope. Other countries like Germany and Finland, they are still discussing the scope. And if I look at my own country, the Netherlands, we saw something really strange, and I hope that they will correct it when the final law is published. But the draft bill foresees two different procedures for breaches of EU law. So in accordance with the new EU Whistleblowing Directive, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they keep in force the old legislation, which provided protection for whistleblowers if they reported work-related abuse with major or public consequences. So, you know, I also provided a comments on that. So that is just weird. So then if you are a whistleblower, you have to ask yourself, okay, so I'm seeing something that's not right. Let's see, what is it? Is it a violation of EU law? Or is it a work-related abuse with major public consequences? Or maybe it is both. So if it is both, then which turn am I going to make? So this is just strange, but you know, it's. I hope it will be corrected in the final version of the law. Now, what does it mean if you are working at a US-based company and you have European operations? Well, I think we should just try to keep it simple and encourage reports on anything that violates the code of conduct or applicable legislation. So if you just for your own whistleblowing procedure, if you just implement something with a very broad scope, and as far as I know, most US companies have already done that, and they are already in that position, you should be fine. So we can debate for a long time whether something, a report would fall under the EU directive or not. But I think it's just more important to just have a very broad scope of your whistleblowing procedure. And then that also solves this issue. Now, then there is something in respect of timing. So not scope, but timing. So as of December 17, 2021, that is when the new legislation is going to enter into scope. It will mean that all public and private organizations with more than 250 employees, they need to have that whistleblowing procedure in place. And the new the whistleblower protection will already apply to them, to the companies with more than 250 employees. Now, there's something, well, it took me a while to find that out, to discover that, but it appears that the new law is already also going to be put in place for all organizations in financial services, no matter how small you are. So regardless of your size. And also to all organizations subject to anti-money laundering or terrorist financing legislation, also regarding to your size. So that means that if you are working in financial services, or if you are operating a casino or a notary, or if you are working at a law firm or an accountant, you are subject to anti-money laundering legislation. And that means that your whistleblowing procedure has to be up to speed on December 17, 2021. Even if you only have 3 employees in the country, which is crazy, of course, because if you have 3 employees, how are you going to nominate an impartial coordinator? But anyway, that's the law. Okay, then small organization, they have 2 years longer to implement this new legislation. So there is in the European directive, there's a December 17, 2023 deadline for all organizations with between 50 employees and 250 employees. That is, In the Netherlands, and I guess also in France, there is already legislation in place that says that you need to have a whistleblowing procedure if you have more than 50 employees. So I expect that in the Netherlands and in France, and maybe in a few other member states, you should just assume that the benchmark is the 50 employees. So above 50 employees, you need to have a whistleblowing procedure that meets the conditions of the directive. So also, and you know, if you are in financial services, it applies to you anyway. So I think the solution would be, no matter in what country you are, just make sure that you are ready at the end of this year. December 17th, 2021, that's the deadline. In practice, that is the most easy thing to remember. Okay, then another thing. So who can refile a report? So the report, it's about somebody who faces retaliation in a work-related context. So naturally, this relates to employees, it relates to interns, contractors, trainees, volunteers, even to non-executive directors. But this European directive is really broad in this respect. So it also applies to shareholders, suppliers, vendors, agents, somebody who assists the reporter. So if the reporter himself or herself is a bit reluctant to report something, he can also ask somebody else to report it on behalf of him or her. And then that assistant is also protected under the EU Whistleblowing Directive. Or maybe it also applies to relatives of whistleblowers, reporters. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I would say just open it up, open up your whistleblowing procedure, open it up for a broad audience on your external website and say, okay, so if anyone sees any violation of our code of conduct or applicable legislation, here's the website where you can submit the report, or here's the telephone number where you can that you can call. Yeah, so you can have long debates about that, but I think the solution is relatively simple. And I also, as far as I know, most US-based companies, they already have that in place. And then there is anonymity. So anonymity is not really addressed in the European directive. So the European institutions, they leave it up to the member states. It's left to the national governments to decide whether they want to oblige companies to create this possibility to also make anonymous reports. So in the end, we may come up with a situation that there will be maybe countries where this is allowed or even obliged. And there may be countries where it's not obliged. Again, the solution is, I would say, is simple. So I would enable anonymous reports anywhere. So I consider that to be a best practice anyway. So especially when people are not inclined to report because they fear retaliation. I always say, so one of the most important methods to take away that fear is to say, okay, so, you know, you can also make an anonymous report and we're not going to try to find out who you are. Okay. Now, if we look at, okay, so what does this mean for, suppose you are a US headquartered company. So what is new? What is different? Please bear in mind that the GDPR, so the data protection regulation, still applies. So the status of Privacy Shield, so Privacy Shield is off the table. So probably you got to bear in mind that European personal data probably has to stay within the EU. So that is something to bear in mind. Of course, there is this reversal of the burden of proof. So I think that is an important aspect. It's also new. I don't see that I don't think that we have it anywhere else in the world. there is this obligation to confirm that you receive the report within 7 days and that you provide substantive feedback within 3 months. So that means that whenever you receive a report, you better start working on that as quickly as possible. So because the 3 months is let's say it's a deadline. So if possible, it would be good to provide feedback upfront. Anyway, my take on this is that I always want to make sure that my whistleblowers that they know that I'm working on the case. So I provide feedback, let's say, on a monthly basis anyway, at least. And after 3 months, you don't need to have the final conclusion yet. At least as the whistleblower knows that you are working on the case and progress is being made. Because otherwise this confidentiality clause may become invalid, and the whistleblower can go outside and go to the press or to the authorities. Another important thing to realize is that there is this condition of a competent, impartial coordinator. I would expect, so if you are coordinating the whistleblowing procedure from the US, think about, okay, so is that really possible in line with the GDPR? And are you, as a coordinator, are you really independent? What I always advise my clients to put a compliance charter in place that specifically determines, so a compliance charter that is signed off by the board, that specifically determines that you, as a compliance officer, that you are acting independently, and that you are free to look into any documents if they are relevant, and raise anything that you find important, something like that. So I put that in a compliance charter. So it would be good to bear that in mind. That the coordinator has to be competent and impartial. You know, and if you are working in an EU member state and you have a small operation over there, think about, okay, so if you let these things handle by your local resource, is that resource, is he or she competent and impartial? So that's something to bear in mind and to reconsider, I think. Which brings me also to, let's say, my new company, the Integrity Coordinator. So what we do at the Integrity Coordinator is that we provide easy-to-use whistleblowing investigation procedures. And we can be that impartial, competent coordinator, where we confidentially communicate with a reporter, discuss the issue, contact the management, and then coordinate the investigation if needed. In the Netherlands, where I'm based, we can also take care of the mandatory annual report for the Works Council. I have 20 years in experience and 14 years in rolling out, coordinating whistleblowing procedures for multinationals, but also for small companies, and I coordinated a couple hundred cases. And I have access to a network of independent investigators. I also drafted, by the way, a brochure for the Dutch Whistleblowing Authority on internal investigations. It's also available in English, so let me know if you are interested in that. Yeah. So I'm getting towards the close, so then I guess I still have 5-6 minutes for questions. So why are we doing all this? So I specifically like this report from the Boston Consulting Group. It was published in 2017. It provides some evidence that ethical companies actually perform better financially in the long term. And sometimes I think that this was one of the main drivers behind the current hype of the ESG investments. So I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum beginning of 2018 when this report was where this report was discussed, and I thought it made quite an impact. So as ethics and compliance officers, we know this. So the benefits of a good speak up system, but I think it works like this. So if you have a good speak up system, you will be able to identify and address problems early. You will have, as a result, you will have fewer investigation and litigation costs, fewer fines, and less management time spent on problems. So the management can spend that time coming up with creative solution instead of solving problems. You'll have a better reputation. And if you have a good speak up system and a good procedure, investigation procedure, this organizational justice will increase the trust in you as an organization. And that again will stimulate the sharing of knowledge and ideas and create a better, more creative work environment. So I think that is the reason why these companies who have a lot of reports, why they also perform better financially. This is more or less the last slide. So I always encourage people to come up to make reports. I also look at trends. So at a given moment, I was coordinating a whistleblowing procedure, and I noticed that there were quite a few reports coming in from Africa. And then the question is always like, okay, so what's happening? Is something bad happening in Africa? Or is there another reason why the reports in Africa, where there's a sudden spike in the reports in Africa? So I started making a couple of phone calls, and I called a couple of people. And in the end, I found out what was going on. So it appeared that we had a new HR manager overlooking the Africa region, and she was on a trip traveling around the continent and visiting all the headquarters. And every headquarter that she used, she had a couple of posters on the whistleblowing procedure, and she put them on the back of the toilet door. So people would go in the office, they would sit on the toilet, they would have a few moments for their own, and they would look at the whistleblower procedure poster and think like, oh, okay, yeah, I have something that bothers me. And then they would make a call. So, something, it's an almost no cost solution, but posters on the back of toilet doors. As soon as we can get back to the office again, that would be my recommendation. Now, here are my contact details, but I also have time for a few questions. So Aaron, please, are there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, do you see the chat? There should be a list of questions for you there.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I missed that, but I see it now. Okay. Okay, are money rewards given to whistleblowers? So, so under the EU Whistleblowing Protection Directive, probably not. Is it unconstitutional in some European countries? No, I don't think so. Yeah, so I noticed that as well. So the US SEC saw a 35% increase in reporting. And did the EU have a similar trend? Yeah, this is something I don't know. So what I expected in the Corona situation, bearing in mind the fraud triangle, there's more pressure. There's a lack of controls, and people can easily rationalize why they have to do something that is not according to the rules. So I expected a lot of fraud going on, and therefore I would also expect that there would be more whistleblowing reports. Now we see that in the reporting to the SEC, but strangely enough, we don't see that in other reports. So yesterday I attended a webinar conducted by Navex, and they saw actually a decline in whistleblowing reports. And I know in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, they saw the same. In the Netherlands, we see the same with the House for Whistleblowers. So it looks like the US SEC is really the exception here. And I was wondering, okay, so what is that all about? So maybe it is because people are more inclined to go outside when they see something. So maybe people are they feel less within the team, let's say. So maybe that is a reason why we see a 35% increase at the SEC and not anywhere else. Yeah. Yeah. I think anonymous reporting, I think we discussed that. Is it necessary to provide a contact for the whistleblower to have personal contact with the company? No, not necessarily. So you can also use mechanisms like whistleblowing platforms where you can, for example, submit a complaint, submit a report, and then then you post something back without knowing the identity of the reporter. Then, of course, it's up to the reporter to go back to that platform and to see what the investigator or the coordinator has posted. So that's, that often makes those types of investigations very difficult. But it's not necessary to provide a contact for the whistleblower, so you can remain anonymous. In Sweden, reporting currently is limited to reporting on matters relating to key or leading persons. Yeah, indeed. So is it your understanding that the proposed Swedish law will broaden that to all employees? Yes, so that is my expectation, indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think we have one more question, and I think we're good. Just sent it to you.
Yeah, so which difference do you feel is going to be the most difficult for US companies to understand or to adopt? I think, so there were a couple of things that I put on the slide there. So I think it's mainly about dealing with the reversal of the burden of truth, of proof. It's about having that impartial, competent coordinator. And it's also about the timelines. So responding, confirming the receipt within 7 days, that will not be that much of a problem. But that you have to come back with substantial feedback within 30 days, I think that might be a challenge. So something really to keep in mind when you're operating the whistleblowing procedure. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Indeed. Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Thanks, Kurt.
So see you around. Thanks. Okay. Bye, everyone.